welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to colleagues joining in the room here in Bern and all around the world. Thank you so much for joining us on the final day of the World Data Forum for this session on building trust in the humanitarian data ecosystem. I'm not entirely sure where the camera is, so if it looks like my eyes are darting around, that's why, but it's great for us to be joined by colleagues here and to have everyone online joining us, and we really look forward to your active participation and questions throughout the session. My name is Stuart Campo, and I'm the team lead for data responsibility at the UNOCHA Center for Humanitarian Data, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this session today. To get us started, I'd like to welcome Christine Le, the Deputy Head of the Peace and Human Rights Division at the Swiss Department for Foreign Affairs. Christine, over to you.
Thanks very much, Stuart. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this session this afternoon. Humanitarian organizations need to collect and share data for a growing variety of reasons. These include coordination, more efficient service provision, and accountability. At the same time, humanitarian organizations have to ensure that the data is only used for humanitarian purposes and does not cause harm to vulnerable populations. As one of the main recipients of such data, donors play a key role in ensuring responsible data sharing and use. When conflicts or disasters occur, the international community just relies on the effective work of humanitarian organizations. We as donor states have a particular responsibility to create an environment that allows humanitarian organizations to successfully carry out their mandate. Such an environment includes donor requirements for data sharing that are in line with humanitarian principles and conducive for humanitarian action. In the past years, we realized in Switzerland that there was a lack of a shared understanding on responsible data sharing between humanitarian organizations and donor states, and all of this in the absence of common guiding principles. This gap has resulted in risks of exposing vulnerable populations. In response to this challenge, the Humanitarian Data and Trust Initiative, HDTI, convened by the ICRC and the UNOCHA Center for Humanitarian Data, as well as Switzerland, we initiated a dialogue process on responsible data sharing between humanitarian organizations and donors at Wilton Park in September last year. The goal of this process was to examine and build a common understanding around the objectives, risks and constraints related to data sharing between humanitarian organizations and donors in order to develop a set of principles for responsible data sharing in this domain. This dialogue comprised 2 Wilton Park meetings, one in September 2022 and one in this past September, 2 pieces of independent research conducted by the Global Public Policy Institute and the University of Manchester, and a series of consultations with different stakeholder groups. In today's session here, we will present and discuss the current results of this dialogue process on responsible data sharing in humanitarian settings with a broader stakeholder base, with you, and particularly with a view for future collaboration on this critical topic. Together, we will explore how states, humanitarian and international organizations can make commitments for collective action that will maximize the use of data in humanitarian context while doing no harm. Responsible data sharing in humanitarian context is an extremely intertwined subject. It is key to draw on a variety of expertise to make real progress and to come up with the best possible solutions and guiding principles. With this, we will come to safe, ethical, and effective data sharing. I think it's particularly important to reflect on the opportunities and challenges of data sharing in a holistic manner. But we must also be honest about the limits of our respective knowledge and expertise. So the UN World Data Forum, which Switzerland is very proud to co-host and host it here in Bern, hybrid but still a little bit in person after we had to postpone it this year. This forum is an excellent setting to dive deeper into the discussion with an open mind and to look at all different aspects of the problem. We should really benefit from the spirit that we find here in this setting today. Based on the insight and feedbacks of today's session, we will share the jointly shaped draft principles for responsible data sharing with interested participants in early November for consultation. Our ambition is that the framework will inform a common approach by humanitarian organizations and donors in the future. I would therefore already now like to thank you all for joining us in this important discussion today, and I look forward to your continued engagement in the future process. The success of this endeavor relies on the invaluable engagement, and in this sense, I look forward to a fruitful discussion today and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christine, for those opening remarks. And thank you again for hosting us here. It's really exciting to be in person, at least in part, to be able to explore these issues together. We'll look forward to welcoming you back for some closing remarks at the end of the session. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists, and again, this is a hybrid event, so I'm joined here on stage by one of our panelists, Vincent Cassard, who's the Deputy Head of the Data Protection Office at the ICRC, and then hopefully on your screen you can see our two other panelists, Irina Konovalli, who's the Chief of the Norms and Standards Section in the Global Data Service for UNHCR, and Nuno Nunes, who is the Global DTM Coordinator and the UK DOE Liaison for IOM. Irina and Nuno, welcome, and maybe just a thumbs up to make sure that all audio and video is working well. Perfect. So to get us started, Vincent, I'd like to ask you to share a bit of the findings and initial outputs from the process that Christine mentioned we've initiated just over a year ago, to set the stage and give us a sense of really what's at stake when we're talking about sharing data responsibly between humanitarian organizations and donors.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and thank you for welcoming me in this hybrid but nonetheless vivid assembly. Christine already highlighted the objective of these discussions, and it's clearly about finding a balance between the need to share and the request to share more and more disaggregated data for extremely good reasons of coordination or accountability, and the obligation to do no harm and to be extremely careful in the environments we are working in as humanitarian organizations. We are dealing with populations that are that can be in difficult security situation or specifically vulnerable because of their situation or location. So why on earth did we choose to talk only about this aspect, sharing data with donors? It can seem extremely limited, and I understand that there is this question. I will not try to explain, I will give a real anecdote. Last year we were preparing reports for donors, as we always do, and there was I'm talking about medical reports in that case, or medical activities, and we had two reports. We had one that is a report specifically on sexual violence and response we have in a situation of conflict, of situation of violence. And in there was a number of statistics and information related to beneficiaries of treatment and follow-up. On the other hand, there was a broader report on health activities, and de facto, and for good reasons as well, the health section was disaggregated, and notably on gender. Therefore, if you took these two reports together, you had the gender on the one hand, on the sexual violence report on the other hand. Because the sexual violence is really limited, it's a limited data set, we basically focused on conflict situation on specific regions. So there was a very limited number of beneficiaries there. Basically, you can identify extremely easily male victims of sexual violence by these two reports. And that's where we realize, okay, we do have a problem. We have strong guidelines, we have data protection principles, we have discussions with donors and with other organizations, but then how can this happen? Because if in wrong hands, in a country or a context where this was not accepted, it could lead to discrimination or worse, what can we do? Therefore, we, within the HDTI partners, decided to go on a dialogue at Wilton Park. We organized it at Wilton Park to have a safe space for this discussion, because it could be sometimes complicated. And two research were commissioned, one on the specific risks and constraint of sharing data, basically from an organization's perspective, and another one on the objectives and benefits of getting more disaggregated data for specific reasons. And I will not go into the details of each element, but I would like to highlight a few points. First, there was a confirmation of a number of risks that we had identified. The risk of re-identification of individuals in specific situations, sometimes it's a level of aggregation, or a risk that this data was actually going to be used for non-humanitarian purposes, which is quite important in terms of neutrality and the access and trust we can get. But what is more interesting is that they highlight things that I don't think we saw coming. First, that it's an extremely complex system. So we're not talking about donors and humanitarian organization. We're talking about as well third-party provider, third-party monitoring, private sector. Maybe there's a third-party monitoring on cash assistance that leads to a bank, that leads obviously to a host state government. So the system is extremely complex. The second point is that it confirmed that there is a lack of coherence. The easy answer is, oh yes, donors are sometimes complicated because, you know, the parliament wants something and then the Ministry of Finance wants something, so there's many requests. But it's not only that, it's as well that as it's a complex system, basically going from a big donor to a beneficiary, these different steps make it extremely complicated and sometimes incoherent. And the third point, I think, which was obvious, but that is the key, is that we realize there's a strong issue related to affected population, their fundamental rights to control what is done with their data, their right of agency, basically their right related to personal data protection. So the conclusion was basically that it's a conversation worth having, it has an impact, and we want to find solutions to make progress together on this.
Great. Vincent, thank you for that overview of both the kind of key issues at play and also what the research helped us confirm. I remember in those initial discussions last year, there was a sense through anecdata, right, experiences and stories we had all either had or heard, that these issues were prevalent, but the research really helped pin down the fact that these are issues that different organizations are grappling with. So building on this initial overview, I'd like to come next to Irina to hear through UNHCR's experience how some of these risks, but also how some of the potential benefits of responsible data sharing manifest in your operations around the world. Irina, over to you.
Thank you very much introduction, Stuart. And it's really a pleasure to be part of this session today and to share some of UNHCR practice, thinking, and plans with regard to responsible data sharing. As we all know, UNHCR and its partners collect a significant quantity and diversity of data to enable evidence-informed decisions, deliver its mandate, demonstrate impact, and mobilize resources. Definitely, providing data to donors is important to help donors understand our programs and assess the impact on our beneficiaries. Let me bring two examples from UNHCR on the opportunities and benefits of sharing data with donors. The first one is the example that comes clearly into my mind in the context of targeting activities. In many situations, UNHCR and others face difficult choices due to tight budget circumstances and need to develop targeting approaches for their programs. In Chad, for example, UNHCR and the World Bank collaborated to impute poverty rates for refugees using data from UNHCR's refugee registration database, supplemented with available socioeconomic data on assets and animal ownership. The resulting data allowed UNHCR and its partners to better target their assistance, assess the targeting strategy, and to advocate for the expansion of humanitarian assistance. So in this case, aggregate data and microdata were responsibly shared with the donors as an evidence base to demonstrate how targeting decisions were made and the extent to which the targeting strategy was efficient. Another example that I would like to bring is, of course, related to COVID situation that we all have faced. Like many organizations, UNHCR sought to adapt its data collection methods to the context, characterized by reduced access to populations. The use of phone surveys increased in many settings as a way to collect key information to understand the impact of the pandemic on persons of concern to UNHCR. For example, how COVID situation affected vulnerabilities and access to services. High-frequency phone surveys were conducted by UNHCR alone or with World Bank in both forcibly displaced persons and host communities in countries such as Nigeria, Lebanon, Kenya, Costa Rica, and Mexico. In Nigeria, for example, the surveys generated information about the impact of COVID on loss of jobs and sources of household income. The evidence of high and rising food insecurity allowed UNHCR to raise awareness with donors and partners. And of course, it also informed UNHCR's coordination with WFP in the formulation of a response plan. And I would like also to bring one example of constraints and risks that we all face when sharing data, or possibly when sharing data. And I would like to speak about sharing of microdata. Microdata is useful in its immediate programming purposes. Once curated and anonymized, it can also be used for indicator baseline calculation, trend analysis, historical analysis, forecasting modeling, and so on and so forth. It can therefore be of great interest and used to donors for those purposes. But to be able to responsibly share anonymized microdata and fully capitalize on the investment made to collect it, organizations need to be able to ensure that it is safely stored in a format that is interoperable and readable, that it includes a minimum set of metadata, and a rigorous process is in place for curation and release. In the absence of such technical and organizational measures, there is a risk that sensitive data will be published, or that the dataset alone or in combination, as just presented by Vincent, allows for the re-identification of individuals, and this is a very high risk. In humanitarian context, the risk of re-identification can lead to harms and threats that are similar to the very situation that led people to flee in the first place, and further undermines their rights, fundamental rights, as I mentioned. For this reason, UNHCR, in collaboration with UNHCR and the World Bank Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement, is currently working to develop and implement procedures on the curation and anonymization of data sets for eventual publication on its public-facing microdata library, for which donors and other external access can access anonymized microdata sets. These procedures seek to ensure that the release of microdata is well governed, standardized, predictable, transparent, and most importantly, aligned with data responsibility principles and practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Irina. Really two concrete examples, particularly the second one that I think should resonate with the audience here. There has been a lot of talk of microdata over the past few days. And given, I think, the focus of this session on specifically humanitarian data, hopefully it comes as a welcome example to the colleagues from NSOs and other entities that are really thinking about microdata management beyond the humanitarian sphere. We have a lot to learn from colleagues that are here at the forum, but also, as you just described, there's some really great work being done. And we at the Center for Humanitarian Data have also really enjoyed collaborating with you and your team on this issue and look forward to continuing that. Nuno, I'd like to come to you next and sort of sticking in the space of both the risks and constraints as well as the opportunities of responsible data sharing with donors, hear a bit more from IOM's perspective on this issue.
Thank you, Stuart. And first, I would like to thank for the invitation to be part of this panel and to say hello to colleagues in the data forum. I think that being part of this discussion is extremely important for us. I'll try not to repeat issues brought up by ICRC and by UNHCR. We fully second all of them, like the relevance of all the points. And I'll try to then summarize some of those that I had here. I'll pick up on a sentence that I believe it was written by you, Stuart, while many years ago in the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. And when we were together on the signal obligations, and where he said how humanitarian actors address the absence of common ethical guidance for their use of information, ICTs, and data will determine, positively or negatively, the future of humanitarianism itself. And I think that this sentence summarizes quite a lot of the work that since then, or also by then, we were already trying to conduct, and why it is so important to be with the Swiss government, with ICRC and UNHCR and UNOCHA in this discussion. We have 86 86 missions. So in terms of putting it, 86 operations, country operations where we collect data. And without standards and guidance, it becomes really difficult to have management solutions that ensure the levels of responsibility that are necessary in an organization like IOM, and also the impacts it might have across the system that we integrate. So in terms of risks, I would say in the sharing of data with donors has certainly an impact on transparency. The space that was mentioned in the opening remarks is very important for us. An understanding that what we are producing and sharing is somehow anchored on overall data responsibility and benefits for the people we intend to deserve. And I believe that this initiative brings something really meaningful in terms of that. In terms of benefits of data sharing with donors, certainly also adding to the details that are necessary for planning and assistance. I think that we find ourselves in the, in a place where in producing this data, there is also accountability for using the data that is produced. And in that sense, the discussions around data responsibility and data sharing versus open data are something where we find ourselves, like trying to float and create guidance for our own teams. In that regard, also the work we have been conducting with UNOCHA HDX in having staff integrated with HDX for a long time, in trying to look at from the data that we produce, which data can be publicly disseminated without requiring specific SOPs due to their sensitivity, has been of great use. I'll stop here perhaps and head later on other points. Thank you.
Great. Nuno, thank you for that. And it's a good reminder that words we write can come back, perhaps not to haunt us, but to remind us of sort of how far we've come in terms of tackling these issues together. So that's a helpful reference as well. I think a lot of what all the panelists have said so far resonates with what we've also heard from the donor counterparts that we've engaged in this process. And it's important to underscore the fact that this is still a process that's underway, but that there are a lot of resources that either in the app or in a follow-up to this event, we'll make sure to make available the various research reports, the synthesis from the Wilton Park Dialogue events, and then eventually the framework which Vincent will talk about momentarily. One point I wanted to mention just in terms of the broader context of the forum and these issues is that, of course, as Christine mentioned, this is an interconnected and complex discussion. We recognize as humanitarians that we do not operate in a silo or in a vacuum, and that there's a lot both that we can learn, but also that we can do together within the broader humanitarian development and peace nexus, as it were, to think about and tackle these issues. We also recognize that states do not have sort of neat divisions between how they engage across this nexus, and so it's really important to move toward common language. This is one thing that's come out really strongly in the dialogue process, but also to be able to have this conversation and perhaps start speaking about this in similar terms and speaking past each other less, which has, just by the nature of the different ways in which we manage data, the different ways in which we think about using data effectively, that has been a challenge in this dialogue more broadly in the sector. So it's really great to see the progress we're making on that front. I'd like to shift now, actually with a brief programming note, to remind people I'm not busy tweeting or posting photos on Instagram. I'm looking at the questions that are coming in. So we have a couple questions in the app already. We will be tracking that throughout, and there's a portion at the end of the session dedicated to Q&A from all of you. So please do keep the questions coming, and after this next round of discussion, we'll turn to the audience and cover as many of those as we can. So we've got a good sense, Vincent, now of the kind of enjeu, what's at stake, what are both the potential risks, but also the potential benefits of data sharing with donors. Where are we going from here? What does sort of the next step on collective action look like, and maybe what can the audience expect in terms of what this process will hopefully yield?
Thank you. As I left the conversation, I concluded by yes, it's a conversation worth having. So we proceeded with the conversation, and we decided to draft principles or commitment for responsible data sharing, specifically for donors and humanitarian organizations. The idea is really to identify gaps, because what I mentioned before are gaps, even though there's a lot, or not a lot, but there are different frameworks that are already quite developed. You have, I don't know, for example, the ICRC co-developed with partners a handbook on data protection in humanitarian action that sets a number of key principles. More recently, the IASC came up with responsible data sharing principles that are extremely helpful. So we have guidance, and there's already something that we are working on. We are not reinventing, in a way, new principles, but we are finding ways to implement them in a constructive manner in the specific framework of this relationship between organization and donors. So there we came up with principles that we're going to share, and obviously it came from a smaller group of donors and humanitarian organization, and we want to expand this discussion and go way beyond to get inputs. So I will present where we are and the key principles we identified. The first one, and you might not be surprised by my previous conclusions, is that priority must be put on the rights and needs of affected population so that they can exercise their right and they can have a proper information, control, choice on the processing of their data. Obviously, in this assembly, it's not a new thing to talk about putting individuals at the center, but with the gaps we saw in the practices, we identify this clearly. Basically, there's really no or very limited understanding or knowledge from the population on how this data is shared up to the level of donors, basically. And that's really a key one. The second one is another obvious one, but central, is because of this incoherence in the understanding or real incoherence in some of the requests, there is a strong need to work on transparency and clarification of these requests and needs and these purposes. There again, we have a lot that is already done in terms of purpose. There are many very clear purpose and objective and positive ones. But we realize through this study is that because precisely this chain of custody of data is extremely complex, what could be clear at a level of a dialogue between a donor and an organization might not be clear at all when it's at the level of the affected population. If you have a third-party monitoring agency supporting an organization to monitor you realize that you have individuals there that are collecting data but without clear understanding of the purpose, without clear capacity to share properly the information and to give the possibility to the affected population, to the individuals to make choices and to have an agency on their data. So really their transparency and clarification is important, and we can't just keep it between donors and organizations. It really has to be at every level of this transmission chain of custody of data, if I can call it this way. The third point is related to risks. Humanitarian action deals with risks that are extremely context-related. What is acceptable and not problematic in a context can be not acceptable or extremely problematic or extremely dangerous for individuals in another. So there is a need, possibly, obviously, to agree on the key principles, but the main one is that we need to have this dialogue, we need to agree on common approach, and it has to be done custom-made on specific contexts. So the main agreement is to agree that we need to have these discussions on specific contexts. Then the fourth one is linked to the capacity and data literacy and the gaps of it or information. So it's obviously a consequence of the previous one, but there's clearly room there to invest in this data capacity. There again, in this assembly and discussion, I don't think I'm bringing something new, but we clearly identified it in this chain of data. We have as well a last point where we mentioned research and development and common agreement on research because of this identification of risks that is difficult, or because of these topics where we realized that there was clearly a need for discussions. Risk is one, but there's as well something around power dynamics that is difficult to unpack very clearly, but that has a strong effect on what type of data goes to donors, basically. Voilà, so for us, the next step is, as mentioned by Christine, de facto to share these draft principles early November and to call for a broader input of stakeholders. And the objective is really to be complementary to what is existent and to bring something actionable for organization and donors alike. Voilà.
Brilliant, Vincent. Thank you for that. And I think, again, for the audience, we really would encourage you to either be engaging through the app and then connecting with us afterwards to make sure that anyone who is interested in tracking this work and engaging and providing feedback can do so. And thank you to those of you who have sent in some additional questions, which we'll get to a bit later in the session. Irina, I'd like to come back to you and sort of building on this set of principles or principled commitments that Vincent just shared, recognize, as we all know, and as many of you have mentioned already, that principles alone or frameworks alone will not sort of help us fully solve the issues that we're grappling with. So what are some additional steps in addition to establishing and putting into practice this common framework that humanitarian organizations and or donors can do to really move the needle on improving responsible data practice in the sector?
Thank you very much, Stuart. And I think I want to pick up on what I also mentioned in the previous intervention, is focusing on the microdata, also of interest to the participants. Humanitarian organizations really should work together to bring their experience, knowledge, and resources on practical approaches to responsible data sharing on microdata. There is good consensus that what we need to do as a community and what we need to avoid vis-a-vis microdata. There is also momentum thanks to the most recent efforts such as this forum, but also the recent work on the Interagency Standing Committee operational guidance on data responsibility in humanitarian action. I would like also to draw your attention to that of the audience. But there are also many lessons that are being learned now and are being relearned by different organizations and in different contexts on how to put data responsibility principles and guidelines into action. If we can gather that into a pool of collective knowledge and intelligence, the community will be able to make positive progress faster. I think that's one of the most important, is to bring that knowledge. And yes, I would like to link to again to the intervention that I made previously on the joint example, joint initiative in the context of forced displacement is the work of UNHCR and World Bank through the Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement. Currently, the Joint Data Center is engaging partners to collate information on the practices, needs, and gaps related to the responsible curation and dissemination of forced displacement microdata. It will integrate these into a common framework for all to draw on microdata, aiming to foster more responsible data sharing and improve outcomes for the forcibly displaced. Given its unique setup as a collaborative and cross-organizational center, the Joint Data Center is well placed to act as a convener of collectors, curators, and users of microdata on forced displacement. And we are happy to see this broad support across the community of the organizations working in forced displacement. Going back to the broader humanitarian picture, we should actively work together across the wider humanitarian data ecosystem on how to apply data responsibility principles in practice. That is why it is so positive and important to bring organizations together through the initiatives like Humanitarian Data Trust Initiative. And we should take this opportunity to work together to share what we are learning early rather than later in the process. In terms of what donors can do, for sure, donors can encourage this joint work, fund this work, and reinforce its positive outcomes. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Irina, and thanks for, again, sharing some of those concrete examples of things that are already underway, but also things that we can invest more in together. Nuno, coming back to you, a similar question in terms of what concretely we can do to sort of make this emerging set of principles a reality and advance data responsibility, and particularly responsible data sharing between humanitarian organizations and donors.
Thank you, Stuart. I'd like to structure the answer to that along two big lines. One, I think that one is around standards and around defining principles, which we tend to do, or we try to do sometimes. Each agency building up what is necessary for it to operate under a general framework of data responsibility. But in some cases, we might miss the legality or the consensus that would allow us to move fast. So initiatives around those standards are super important. I'll give you an example that from inside IOM, we have very strong data protection, data security, and data governance policies inside the organization. And the joint work with the Berkman Klein Center, Cyber Law Center, highlighted to us how data sharing was much less, almost understood as deriving from these other three policies, but not having a policy on itself defining what to be shared. And as a consequence, in our own team, we hired two colleagues for the first time that are just dedicated to data sharing and trying to understand if the existing gaps are then worth addressing on a policy of its own, or by improvements in the existing policies. To make policies in big organizations might not be an easy endeavor. The second line that I would like to mention is, or before I go into that, I think that this joint work between IOM, or co-led by IOM, UNHCR, and OCHA in terms of the data responsibility guidelines at the ICRC was a very nice step in that regard. And what is happening right now in your collaboration with ICRC and the Swiss government is definitely also a welcome piece of guidance. The other part I would like to mention is that in terms of data responsibility, when it comes to agencies and donors, there is possibly an emphasis on the data itself, how it is collected, and less of attention to those foundational aspects that relate to highly technical ICT procedures. And in that regard, the data governance and data security seem to be something that, if we want to invest from a data programming, we need to make a request to donors for something that is not exactly what they want to fund. They want to fund, data for programming or data responsibility from a policy perspective, and not necessarily an ICT improvement. So how to phrase or rephrase some of those technical ICT requirements in a way that is attractive as foundational for data responsibility that can create bigger attention and investment on that is definitely something that we feel could help us greatly. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nuno, and thanks to all the panelists for these 2 rounds of inputs. We do have a couple questions from the audience that I'll turn to momentarily, but again, encouraging also people here with us in Bern to maybe raise a hand and indicate interest. Great, so we've got at least a couple of questions in the room. I'll start with one of the questions that came in online, and then we'll come over here. So one of the questions that's come through is asking if we could elaborate on how the principles and practices developed in the humanitarian sector would or would not apply to the broader development community. And maybe to give my panelists a little bit of time to reflect before calling on anyone, I can start by just saying, both in the process that we've sort of focused on today, but also in the broader work that's been referenced by various panelists, we certainly, as the humanitarian community, have been engaging with the sets of principles, the guidance, and the frameworks that the development community has advanced over the past few years. There's a lot to learn, both in terms of things like the principles for digital development, but also more specific practices on the development side of the nexus and how we can advance data responsibility. So we've done what we can to incorporate what's working well, promising practice, and frameworks that will be familiar to different operational partners in country into how we're thinking about these issues. But there's certainly more to be done. I'm looking at the screen here to see whether Irina or Nuno might want to come in on this point of how the principles could apply to the broader development community, and then I'll also come, Vincent, to you. Nuno, are you shaking your head as in yes, you'd like to come in? Perhaps over to you.
Yes. It's one of those questions that is good to say that it's a great question, and because we can put it back to the broader community, meaning definitely on the humanitarian sector, we need to adhere to basic principles, to a set of principles that are well defined. And I believe that all of us intend not to harm anyone and produce benefit to people that are perhaps amongst the most vulnerable in the world. So is this concern for vulnerability a minimum denominator for the broader community or not? Because to what extent, it's great that we come up with principles that I think that can apply to these contexts, but which ranges of action actually justify not using a similar concerns as a minimum denominator is something that it's very difficult to answer. Oh.
Absolutely. Irina, did you also want to come in on this question? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll really be quick to say that I've already mentioned one of the opportunities is working together with development partners and the Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement, which actually opens this as a forum, as a platform where we can talk and share different standards. And I think this is what the development community can assist the humanitarian world, is to learn what are the standards there in the development community that we can learn from and we can implement. I would like probably to draw a little bit more on something which was mentioned before, is on the common language. I think this is what we will need to strive at more, to be able to make sure that the data that is collected by the humanitarian community is understood and can be used by the development world. So I think that's another area of focus that we will all jointly need to pursue. Over from my side.
Great, thank you both for that. And Vincent, coming to you, any additional points on this question of how the principles and the practices we're developing might apply to a broader audience?
I think I agree with what was said. I think the complementarity and the chance to improve coherence is there. I hope that there will be some input as well, so that we actually identify, because we believe we have identified gaps. As you say, there's a number of things that we can learn from the development world on frameworks that are already developed, and I hope that together we can make sure we are filling these gaps and be more specific on specific risks or specific situations that have not really been covered not in terms of principles, but in terms of practice and guidelines. So I hope and I invite the development world to jump in the conversation.
Absolutely. I think the invitation is clear now. We really do expect you to engage. So I'll now come to the floor for your question. Yes.
No, I have no question, but I have comment or adding something. My name is Urszula Marklewicz. I am from Poland, and I would like to say that all questions you identified are trust. And accountability and understanding of development by all. If we all understand and trust together and cooperate, then cooperate. So it is a problem. So understanding and trust and cooperation. And I would like to add that they are not just words from my side, but I built research and by 20 years I built a model of human existence and development. It was verified scientifically 2004 for the Union, institutional, verified, also accepted by, appreciated but by Ernst & Young, admitted by European Commission, Polish government for EU regional pilot, informational, educational and development. And 4 years ago, I finished the model and aligned institutional functioning, which was later, which preceded earlier GDP, national accounts and corporate accounts. It is very important also to measure very precisely and I aligned the model with environment, individuals, and 2030 agenda with SDGs. It is possible all to do with that. So yeah, I would like to inform and I would like to forward to the United Nations for a disposal of all countries for information, awareness raising, operation and further development. Oh, it is all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think the model you described really speaks again to this issue of the interconnectedness and complexity of the environments that we're working in, and particularly the populations that we're trying to serve. And absolutely, it's worth reiterating the importance of trust. That's the track within the forum that this event is taking place in, and it's something that we come back to consistently in our discussions, that this is really about building trust through dialogue, but also building trust amongst all the actors in the system. We have another question here on the floor, so I'll come over to you, sir, next.
Thank you. Thank you, presenters, for speaking on this topic, which is a very important one. Building trust. I think when the first speaker spoke about the topic, it was sort of narrowed down to sharing data with partners, with the donors. But every day we grapple with the need to share information with the state. And I'm wondering, I was going through those 7 principles, although I missed the 6th and the 7th. I wanted to know if we could still, if these principles could also be applied in a case where the state is requesting for information which is not microdata, doesn't have any personal identifiable information, but contains potentially sensitive data which could be used against partners who have provided that data. So I'll be very keen to hear from our speakers what they have to say, what advice they would like to provide in such a situation. Thank you.
Thank you. That is an excellent question. It's one both in the context of the process, the HDTI dialogue process that we've come up against, and that certainly in the various fora that the speakers have mentioned, we're grappling with. Maybe just to start, I'll share very briefly from OCHA's experience how we're already trying to navigate those types of requests in different operational settings. The IASC operational guidance that has been mentioned includes a set of principles and also recommendations for how to approach third-party requests. So requests for data that are perhaps from actors with a slightly distinct function from the core humanitarian architecture in, for example, a conflict environment, but where the request might have a legitimate specified purpose and various other components that we would look for. And what we've tried to do is support the establishment of clear information sharing protocols that cater for this type of use case and really put clear terms on the table for both humanitarian organizations and state actors. This is not something that is fully dealt with in the dialogue today or in the broader process, but it's something that we recognize is one of the next steps, both in terms of a stakeholder group that we need to engage more and in terms of clarity on how the different principles might apply. I'll quickly look to my panelists to see if anyone would like to comment on this important question. Vincent, first.
Thank you. Yes, it's clearly an important point and a key point. And I think what we try to unpack is the reality that in this process, there's different actors, and some of them international organizations that have privileges and immunity, that have a specific status, have more facility basically to share data or to protect data because they have a specific mandate that it recognizes as a status. In practice, what is done in this reporting involves as well maybe national partners, basically organizations that are under the obligation to report to their national authority because it's a legal obligation and it's a normal thing to do. So what we have to do there is to acknowledge these different elements and the variety of this status and possibility and obligations, respect this obligation, and within this framework decide what makes sense, what is a risk or not a risk, maybe limit some information collection if there is effectively a risk for specific groups in a context. In other contexts, it might not be an issue, but in a conflict situation, obviously, or it could be difficult to, it could raise clear specific danger for individuals. So this access from the states is, I think we have to start by really putting things on the table and clarifying the legal framework, the different obligations of the different actors, and then decide what we do, what we don't do, and as the ICRC does, in full transparency with the host states in terms of what is shared or not shared and for what purposes. But it's yes, it's clearly a key issue for much broader than this reporting to donors question, but in our operations.
Absolutely, and I'm keeping an eye on our time, so I'm actually going to move to the next and final set of brief reflections from the panelists before we move to our closing remarks. There are a number of questions in the app about building capacity and data literacy for both donors and humanitarian organizations. And for those of you in the room, we have the luxury of, once we switch off, we're certainly happy to come and address additional questions that you might have. So I just want to give each panelist maybe 30 seconds to a minute to reflect either on this question of capacity, and it's really a critical issue that has emerged in the dialogue process, or another closing thought on how we can advance responsible data sharing between humanitarian organizations and donors. So I'll come to you first, Irina, then to Nuno, and then to Vincent.
Thank you very much. And indeed, capacity for the affected populations, building the agency over the data, and ensuring that the people that we are there to serve understand our processes, procedures, and can also have control over their data really stays at the core of our mandate and of everything we do. I think it also stays at the principle of well-known principle to the humanitarian world called accountability to affected populations, where we can take the views and feedback from our persons of concern into our planning and programming. Of course, there are a number of initiatives that are being undertaken, projects and pilots across the world. I think from UNHCR's side, maybe something also linked to the COVID pandemic, a lot of support assistance is now being digitalized, and that of course requires that our beneficiaries understand what we are putting on the mobile applications, what we put in the computers. So it naturally comes with a lot of capacity building of the population. And I think one of the takeaway from this session today, I would like to focus on capacity building that goes across the different dimensions. We've been talking about capacity building between humanitarians and development actors, also understanding between donors and humanitarians. But I think another important aspect is capacity building and literacy of our beneficiaries. And maybe last point that I want to make is to cite UNHCR High Commissioner Filippo Grandi, who just recently talked about the need to share more data. We won't turn the tide in terms of meaningful solutions for displacement without good data. We won't turn the tide if those data are not at the foundation of good partnerships. Therefore, the sharing piece is extremely important. And without all that, we will not be able to mobilize the political attention and resources that are needed to counter those challenges. Hence, we will be focusing and will maintain the focus on internal awareness, on capacity, and we are committed to make progress on responsible data sharing and responsible data access. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Irina. It's a good call to action and reminder of that commitment from UNHCR's side. Nuno, over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. We have a network of 7,400 staff working on data on DTM in the 86 countries plus global locations, etc., and interacting with many different organizations and governments and donors, with ourselves. What if we find here is that from capacity building initiatives that range from capacity building towards the governments that we work with, to internal capacity building on operations or to other actors, there is never a possibility to keep the pace with the pace of technology, and there is never a real possibility. It's almost as if the more literate you are on data, the more illiterate you feel on the potential difficulties and problems across protection and harms that can arise from data. So in this sense, I think that one I mentioned earlier, finding a way to rise the relevance of ICT issues on capacity building it would be very beneficial. Second, also how to on the capacity building that we produce or across different organizations towards governments and donors, how could we work in complementarity and coordination between organizations in a way that reflects some set of common principles? I think that's something we advocate for as IWA. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Nuno, and look forward to continuing that discussion with you moving forward. Vincent.
Thank you. Well, two things. First, we are planning there is a principle on capacity building. What I would like to highlight that capacity building is not big donors and organizations, most of them are around this table. It's up to at every level of the chain. So it has to implicate the capacity building of organizations that often are national organizations within their national law framework that needs to get this capacity, because they are the ones who talk often or who are in direct contact with the affected population. So it has to reach this level. It can't be only a top level one. And the second point is, and it's not only because I'm a member of the Data Protection Office, but across this principle, there's a very strong element related to privacy and protection of personal data. And for this, stating the obvious, sharing data is key, but sharing data is actually data processing. So when you share data, you have the same principle that apply. You need to understand clearly what's the purpose, what are the limits, what do you share, what you don't share, what do you, and how, and have an agreement for that. So if you just go along these lines, step by step, we'll build something stronger.
Excellent. Irina, Nuno, and Vincent, thank you so much. We will move into the final portion of the session, but thanks for your insights. I think it was really rich for the audience, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Christine Le back to the stage to deliver some final reflections based on the discussion today.
Thanks. Now I'm good. Thanks very much, Stuart, and to all the panelists. I have to say, while I was listening to the discussion now, not just amongst the panelists, but also incited by the questions from the room, it really struck me once again of the complexity and urgency of the issue. It's kind of, why are we doing this now? Why haven't we done this for a long time? But also to see how many questions are still open. I mean, it's really this realization, again, new technologies and data sources are helping us make faster and more informed decisions. And we are helping more people with the assistance every year, also thanks to that. But it's really this, this realization, again, that this really poses huge, serious challenges to the privacy and the security of the affected people. To protect the populations in crisis, we must find a way to navigate these ethical and technical issues that are involved when we use or manage these different types of data, and also giving the interconnected nature, which was also now mentioned in different ways, also with the different communities involved, and to see, you talked about the chain of custody. It shows again, we need to work together, the different communities need to work together, and this tends to be a bit of a challenge sometimes in the international system, but I think there also, again, the donors have a very important role to contribute, but probably also the states, the receiving states. So just to say that again, I think this has come out very clearly. And then another point that also came out very strongly is that there have been a lot of policies and principles, strategies that have been developed over the past years, but there is this gap between the global frameworks and the practical application. So we really hope with these principles, which again are principles, but they try to unpack and repack what there is, but then when we go to the next phase, or there will be a next phase, that we really can make a change and become relevant for the practical application, and that it's easy, it's transparent, and all these points that you have mentioned. And so, yeah, we really hope that this process, today's discussion as a contribution to this HTD Wilton Park process will help advance collective action in this area. And we look forward to the engagement from all stakeholder groups, from all of you, from all of those interested, from all of those who have a perspective to bring to the table, to make this work and the results of it relevant and practical, and so that we can really make sure that we maximize the benefit of data in humanitarian action, but also make sure that we're not doing any harm while we're maximizing. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to the panelists and to you, Stuart, for your able moderation of this panel. And I wish you a great continuation of the forum. Thank you very much.